So we'll now move on to another Whig historian, a man named Edward Gibbon. Gibbon is most famous for writing The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Right? Notice how the classical tradition continues within the Western understanding of history, right? There's this obsession, in a sense, with the Roman Empire, even though we don't have this idea that we're living in the Roman Empire anymore, as they did based on the book of Daniel previously. There's still this idea that, hey, this place is very important and it has lessons to teach us. What's very important about this work is that it was a product of a lot of primary source research. Some people previously, when they would write a history, they would just basically copy someone else. But Gibbon, who knew Latin and Greek, would read primary sources. And I want to stress, I don't just mean like he would read Tacitus or Livy or someone like that, or Herodotus. He would actually like go to Italy and read old monuments. So he actually studied material remains too, in order to get the information. Like a lot of times an old monument would have an inscription that would actually have a lot of history on it. He would go read it. So he's really emphasizing the importance of primary source research, of taking a source from here, 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 and here, and putting them together into a narrative. Moreover, in providential history, there's a tendency to focus on the rulers, on powerful people, and on their moral character. This was a good emperor, that's why things went well. This was a good bishop, that's why this country was able to become Christian at this time, something like that. But Gibbon talked about the idea of forces, in a sense, economic, social, cultural, that could impact history. So it's not simply looking at, hey, these important people did these things. Yes, he took that into account. But there was also this idea that there were other broader forces at work. Moreover, Gibbon became very popular because his histories were well written and interesting. So one thing I want to stress with all these people we've been talking about previously, David Hume and Catherine McCulloch, they made a lot of money writing history because they figured out how to make it interesting. There was a hunger for history. Gibbon continues in that tradition. Right? Gibbon continues in that tradition of making well-written and interesting history. But also, what's interesting too, is that Gibbon didn't just move away from providential history, he was actually kind of critical of it. Right? He basically argued that Christianity was the primary cause for the decline of the Roman Empire. Right? So he's kind of rejecting Augustine's ideas of the two cities of God and so forth. And he basically argues that Christianity was one of the main reasons for the barbarism of the Middle Ages. Now, Gibbon's ideas about religion are complex. I don't think he was an atheist. I think he actually stayed a communicant within the Church of England, but he was critical of medieval and some ancient understandings of Christianity. But the key thing is he's taking forces seriously. He's taking Christianity as a force, as a historical force seriously, but moving it out of that idea of providential history where Christianity is good to treating it as not simply something that's kind of neutral, but something that's negative in many ways, though he does find some positive features about Christianity. What's interesting about Edward Gibbon, though, was there's a sense that his own period was so great that they would never fall like the Roman Empire did. So there's this Whiggish kind of confidence, right? There were the ancients, Middle Ages were a decline, then there's now, and we've learned from the ancients and we're not going to make the same mistakes they did. And so everything's just going to keep going great. And then the French Revolution happened, which kind of challenged some of those ideas. The next historian we need to talk about is a Scotsman, a man named Adam Ferguson. And Ferguson is interesting. He started off as a military chaplain who would eventually become a professor and a historian. And guess what? He wrote on the Roman Republic and the importance of morality. Notice, we can't get away from the Romans. Right? They're so important in understanding the Western historiographical tradition. But he also wrote this thing called an essay on the history of civil society, in which he talked about a shared human history of progress. So he saw all of humanity in a sense as progressing. Some people were maybe more farther along than others, but there was this emphasis on we as humans have a kind of shared human nature, and we're all, in a sense, on this road to progress. Now, being a devout Presbyterian, he's tried to figure out this way to bring human progress in line with this idea of God's divine plan. So he understood God as helping to lead and guide humans' progress, with our capacity to sin basically explaining the setbacks. So like I said, providential history doesn't end, but it does change. It's not that God is always eliminated from history. Rather, there's this idea that there's more human action. So in a sense, there's a shift of focus from God. God might still be there, but also more and more on humans. But what's interesting, I think, there's some dispute over whether or not he in fact wrote it, but it looks like he wrote the second version of the history article for the Encyclopedia Britannica, whereas previously it had been a single paragraph. He expanded it into several pages that are very dense, and you'll read his entry, but where he talks about the purpose of history. And while I think there's some issues with it from a contemporary historian's perspective, he has some really good points about what makes good history, and it's something to think about. So far we looked at English historians, but I want us to look at someone who's a bit different. A man named Johann Gottfried von Herder. Herder is German, what will eventually become Germany, basically. And Germany, as we'll see later, becomes an important center of history. And so Herder is one of the people who kind of lays down the foundations for that. So if you think of the two countries that are the most important for American history, it would be Germany and England. So I need to talk a little bit about Germany. Now, von Herder would disagree a bit about Ferguson and about this idea of universal progress. He objected to judging nations according to universal standards. He would say, how can you look back at these people and call them barbarians? You're judging them according to your culture's perspective, and that's unfair to them. If you're going to talk about them, you have to look within their culture and judge them by their own standards. We would call this a relativistic or a approach that would be known as historicism, where instead of trying to apply our understandings of universal values to judge other people, he would say we shouldn't do that. Right? We should try and understand people on their own terms. And what's particularly interesting about him, too, is he tended to avoid focusing too much on elites. A lot of history, including that of people like David Hume and Catherine McCulloch, focused on the elites. And von Herder says, no, the essence of the nation is seen in its folklore. It's seen in the common people, the folk, right? That's what he wants to focus on. And he has a good point, because oftentimes, there, especially during this period, elites tended to share more culture with elites from other countries. So in many ways, English and French elites were more similar to each other than they were to poor English people or poor French people. A French peasant had less in common with a French aristocrat than a British aristocrat had, right? The British aristocrat had more in common with a French aristocrat than that British aristocrat would have with a British peasant. So for Herder, you want to focus more on the people. They're the essence of the nation. And he tended to understand the nation in terms of language. So what constitutes the nation are the people who speak a specific language. One reason he focuses on this, and we'll talk more about this in the next section, is because Germany is divided. There is, in a sense, no Germany. There are Germans. There's people who speak German, but they don't have a single unified state. And so he, in a sense, is laying down the foundations that can justify unifying that state. We need a state to see the interests of the German people. Who are the German people? The people who speak German and who share, in a sense, this culture, this folklore that comes about because they share German language and culture. Now, there's a certain tension here. How much do humans share, and how much are we different? right? With people like Adam Ferguson, in fact, with a lot of the Whigs, there's this idea of shared human progress. And while they could be judgmental towards people who they didn't see as progressing, they did, in a sense, share this idea that we're all humans. We all share something. They tend to focus on that kind of similarity. For von Herder and others like him, there's this tension to focus on how we're different. And this, again, is a big difference between Christian history. Christian history was a universal history. It focused on the idea of this shared Christian community that could have many different types of people, English, French, Germans, lots of different types of people. And even though there were people outside the Christian community, you were still supposed to invite them in. That's a universal understanding of history. But von Herder is focusing more on a secular, particularistic understanding of history that did not focus on a universal religious community, but on a specific national community. And when you do that, you're focusing more on how people are different as opposed to what they share. And this is a constant tension, right? And so finally, and I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but I really need to talk about this issue of exploration. I already kind of mentioned it with the Catholics in the 16th and 15th century going out exploring. Later on, so will the English, the Americans, of course, even though we're not technically exploring that much, we're going to go out and build an empire. And there's this question, how do we fit these non-Western people into history? How do you fit the Aztecs? How do you fit the Native Americans? How do you fit the Hawaiians? How do you fit the Japanese people into history? How do you do that? And what's also happening is increasingly Europeans and later Americans are more able to dominate the world. So there's a difference between trying to fit people into history when you're kind of on equal standing. But what happens when you're materially more advanced than them? What happens when you have artillery and battleships and they have bows and arrows? So there's this, not only is there this attempt to, how do we fit people into this history, there's various answers as to why Europeans and later Americans are so dominant. And there's this idea that there's something special about the West, about Europeans, and I say the West to include the United States. And this, of course, affects how you understand history, because then what happens is since you understand your civilization as the civilization, right? When I teach world civilizations, it's in plural, and it means like, here's a Chinese civilization, an Indian civilization, a Roman civilization. We're not making a judgment call about which one's better. But here they're talking about civilization singular, and we represent it, and we can dominate the world, and therefore we get to talk about how the story of the world. We get to tell the history of the world, where we're the center, and we get to judge everyone, and we get to set the standard. So we'll finish up there with the kind of ideas of Renaissance and Enlightenment and so on. We'll continue on with the development of scientific history later.